Hello there, Brick Fanatics. Let's talk about Star Wars video game LEGO. This year, arguably the largest piece of Star Wars media to debut will be a video game, Ubisoft's Star Wars Outlaws, which has a budget which is going to be significantly larger than anything that Star Wars has ever popped on Disney+, and which will make significantly more money than any show that has ever been put on Disney+, with the possible exception of Bluey. That's assuming that the game turns out okay, because sometimes you get something like a Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League and nobody ever actually plays it. But assuming that everything goes well with Outlaws, this could end up being a defining piece of Star Wars media. No doubt Ubisoft and Lucasfilm Games are hoping that this will do the same kind of thing as Hogwarts Legacy has done for Harry Potter, if not necessarily redefining the cultural public image of the brand, certainly making an awful lot of cash. The question is then, well, where are all the Star Wars Outlaws LEGO sets? And not just Star Wars Outlaws, where's the Jedi Survivor or Jedi Fallen Order LEGO sets? Where are the Star Wars Hunters LEGO sets? Although that one seems like less of an ideal choice. LEGO has always had a somewhat complicated relationship with the video game wing of the Star Wars brand. To some extent, LEGO will engage where relevant and crucially where there's nothing else really on the schedule, but also a lot of things tend to get overlooked. The very first LEGO set to tie in with a Star Wars video game specifically was the Rogue Shadow for The Force Unleashed, which was all the way back now in 2008. In that case, the LEGO set was on store shelves long before the game actually released, which was fairly similar to how the LEGO Group and Star Wars approached the release of every Star Wars film and the corresponding LEGO sets. That makes a certain degree of sense because The Force Unleashed was approached almost as a film without a film in terms of its wider merch. And it's not the first time that Lucasfilm has attempted something like this, taking a game and trying to build an entire merchandising and promotional material kind of experience around it so that it ends up feeling like a much bigger deal than, let's be honest, it kind of actually is. Like, no shade to The Force Unleashed or to other games that Lucasfilm have tried to do this kind of thing with, but they're not as memorable as a new film, and it's hard to get around that. I suppose we need to talk a little bit about LucasArts and about why we now have Lucasfilm Games instead. The short version is that LucasArts was brilliant, and then Disney bought Lucasfilm and shut the entire thing down, and then suddenly realised that they still actually needed a video game publisher of some form, so they've then brought it back. The long version, right, so George Lucas, you might have noticed, is a little bit of a maverick when it comes to inventing stories and wanting to really push the boat out with new technology and new narrative experiences with that new technology. And so it's not a huge surprise that he founded LucasArts, which was initially a game studio that focused on narrative-driven games, mostly adventure games of the kind of like Maniac Mansion and Sam & Max and Monkey Island. And LucasArts very quickly established itself as one of the go-to like big defining companies for these amazing story-driven adventure games. And they had just gorgeous artwork, and they had very clever, very funny writing, and gameplay that was something like hitting yourself in the face with a cricket bat. But you were willing to tolerate these obscure, terrible puzzles for all of the wonderful immersive storytelling that was going on in these games. Now, eventually, those kinds of games fell out of favour, and LucasArts somewhat transitioned from making these kinds of games themselves to most often serving as a publisher for a bunch of different studios, all working on the Star Wars license. And they were throwing that Star Wars game license out like it was candy. Like, they were just giving it to anybody who would stay still long enough to pick it up. We had some brilliant games in this period. You had Dark Forces / Jedi Knight. You had the Bounty Hunter game was decent. You had Pod Racer. You had Command and Conquer turned into Galactic Battlegrounds. Took me a second to remember that one. Just so many really, really solid games from studios that would go on to do things like, say, Call of Duty. I think the crowning jewel for a lot of people is Knights of the Old Republic, which was given to a little-known studio called BioWare, who had done a few role-playing games, and who after that went on to do things like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, which are some of like the big defining games of that particular generation. And Knights of the Old Republic is still held up by a lot of people as being the definitive Star Wars game to this day. I'm not saying necessarily that it is the absolute best game of all of the ones that LucasArts put out during this period, but it's basically the best game that LucasArts has ever put out, especially during that period. Along the way, in the absence of other Star Wars media, LucasArts to a certain degree stepped up to the plate and said, all right, we don't have a new film to promote, but what if we did a game that was basically a film? And the first big one of these they did was called Shadows of the Empire, which released on the Nintendo 64. This had a tie-in novel and a tie-in comic and a range of action figures. Lucasfilm essentially went at this with the attitude of, this is basically a film, we just don't have the film. And some of this stuff was actually really good. Like, obviously the Nintendo 64 game is not going to have the depth and the breadth of the story that you would get from a Star Wars film, but then you've got the supplementary materials, you've got the book and you've got the comic, and they all add up together to give different perspectives on the same story for different characters, which is a delightful way of doing it. The Force Unleashed then, a little more than a decade later, was approached with the same kind of strategy. Well, we've wrapped up the prequel trilogy, what's next? Let's do a game that is basically a film in terms of its cultural clout. And while I don't think that The Force Unleashed ever really hit the same kind of cultural ubiquity as an actual film, certainly it was very present for a great moment in time. So the game released with its own LEGO set, and then the LEGO Group did something similar for the Old Republic, which was a game that took the bones of Knights of the Old Republic and blew them out to a mass multiplayer online proportion, something akin to World of Warcraft, something that was big and something that was hoped to be the next big thing in gaming, much like World of Warcraft at the time. Now, the Old Republic survives to this day and is presumably fairly profitable still, otherwise they wouldn't keep the servers online. This game was made by BioWare, again much like Knights of the Old Republic, and then published by EA as one of the first EA games, because EA had bought BioWare by this point. Something big is coming with EA in this story, but we're not quite there yet. What matters is, initially for the Old Republic, we got a bunch of pretty cool LEGO sets, and then we got nothing. Nothing for quite a while. A few years into the Old Republic, Disney purchased Lucasfilm, and they looked at LucasArts and they said, we don't need this, and tossed it. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, I'm kind of not. There were a lot of very interesting Star Wars games in development around this time that just never saw the light of day, like Star Wars 1313, which was set on Coruscant and is believed to have fairly prominently featured a certain Mandalorian bounty hunter. I'm not getting into whether Boba Fett counts as a Mandalorian or not. I'm just not touching that. I cannot be bothered. Instead, Disney doesn't get video games, really, I think. I mean, they've done some decent games in the past. I remember growing up with the Mickey Mouse and the Donald Duck games and DuckTales and all of that and thinking it was fantastic, but Disney as a company I don't really think have understood where games have gone in the past 30 years. And so they looked at Star Wars and they were like, no, we don't need Star Wars games. We don't need a lot of these. I tell you what, we'll get rid of LucasArts and we'll hire EA. We'll give them an exclusive license and they can just make the Star Wars games and then just give us the money that they get from these Star Wars games. And my theory is that EA, having been given an exclusive license to do Star Wars games, basically said, right, now nobody can make any Star Wars games. We have no competition from anything vaguely Star Wars-like, which is brilliant because we get more money when a Mass Effect game comes out. Or when a Dead Space game, or when just all the other EA properties that they've somewhat mishandled over the years. I'm getting sidetracked. EA... you don't need me to bash on EA. There are plenty of people on YouTube who will do that for you without you needing to ask. And it's only with Battlefront and Battlefront 2 that we finally started getting LEGO sets based on Star Wars video games again. And without wanting to denigrate these too much, it does feel like they're a little bit more generic than what had come before. So with The Force Unleashed and with The Old Republic, we had specific ships from these particular games. We had specific minifigures that were beyond just the normal standard soldiers. And then with Battlefront, we got a lot of battle packs and some of the significant characters, but there was an awful lot less world building and originality in these Battlefront games anyway, and you can kind of tell that it was difficult for that to translate over into LEGO sets. Anyway, finally, with Jedi Fallen Order, we got a Star Wars game that was meaty and rich, that the audience and the fans who were playing these games were connecting with, that were something more than just the kind of generic, just standard presentation of Star Wars heroes and villains. They had a new kind of world here, and with that came one LEGO set. It was the brick-built BD-1, and that's all we got until this year's Cal Kestis is going to show up. So with all of that, with like all of the different things that they could do from Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, we could have ships, we could have a greater variety of different characters, we could have bases and playsets, and instead all we got was one brick-built droid and then finally now a minifigure. And it almost feels like the LEGO Group aren't sure if they want to commit to this in the same way that they have done for LEGO sets for various different video games in the past. And that's completely understandable to a certain degree because you don't necessarily know how hard some of these games are going to hit, especially with EA's crop of Star Wars games being a little bit kind of hit and miss and not necessarily wowing audiences as much as people might hope. Games are, let's be honest here, hard to make. It takes an awful lot of energy and effort to make a video game, and more often than not they run into delays and snags along the way, especially at the moment where gamers are expecting a tremendous level of graphical fidelity, which is a lot of work to maintain and doesn't always come together very easily. And I completely understand why the LEGO Group might look at upcoming Star Wars games and think, we're going to hold off until we're absolutely certain that these are popular before we commit ourselves to a big range of different LEGO sets for them. What's more puzzling is why they've decided to skimp on Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, given that these games are generally well liked and definitely have an audience. And it might simply be the fact that for all that these games have done particularly well, they don't have the same cultural ubiquity as a film. They don't have like the same wider public consciousness as a Disney Plus show. And suddenly we come back to the issue that has been there with all of these Star Wars games going back to the beginning, basically, which is when you're making a Star Wars game, it might make more money than a film, because a lot of games do make a lot more money than films, but you still end up really only reaching a relatively small audience. And that audience might be very passionate for merchandise based on this particular game, but you're not reaching the same kind of widespread appeal as you do with Disney Plus, where basically everybody watches it. And by the way, before you leave that comment, yes, I know that you personally do not have a Disney Plus subscription. I am paying close attention to how you are using your credit card. You might want to change your PIN, by the way. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Stephen. And aside from Cal Kestis, we have that Darth Malak minifigure, which is just living rent-free in my mind, because was there a possibility at one point of a Knights of the Old Republic LEGO set this year? Is there some alternate reality where that is a thing that happened? Certainly we know that there was a Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic remake that was planned to be releasing, well, presumably by this point, and that has fallen into significant delays and trouble over the period of time that it has been in development, and so it's really unclear at this point whether that thing will ever actually materialize. Were the LEGO Group at one point working with Lucasfilm Games to make some Knights of the Old Republic sets, because this was presumably a fairly easy slam dunk given the existing popularity of the original game, and then the remake ran into dire straits, and now we're just kind of left in this limbo, and the only trace of that possible collaboration is a Darth Malak figure that doesn't belong in an R2-D2 LEGO set? Or am I just paranoid and turning into that Charlie Day meme? Because I'm probably just turning into that Charlie Day meme. All of this being the case, it really does feel like we need to address the fact that video games are becoming an increasingly large part of the LEGO Group's lineup of brand IPs. Games are overtaking films as the primary thing that the LEGO Group is making LEGO out of that comes from outside sources. So we've got The Legend of Zelda LEGO coming very soon. We've got another rumoured large LEGO Mario set coming very soon. We've got Sonic the Hedgehog. We've got the huge collaboration with Fortnite, which will presumably eventually yield some LEGO sets as well. This is how the LEGO Group is choosing its brand IP partners at the moment. It's kind of favouring the games over the films. And Star Wars is this thing, this weird thing, which, yes, is all about the films, but going back decades has also been all about the games. And there's a huge amount of interest in these games, and they could very easily be translated into LEGO sets, but because the games don't necessarily have that same huge widespread appeal as the films, because you're not necessarily going to know the name of Cal Kestis if you're just a random guy, but you might know Kylo Ren or you might know Rey, then maybe for that reason the LEGO Group Group is squeamish to commit to these video game Star Wars titles, even though the video game Star Wars titles are actually quite a big deal, and even though in other aspects of its lineup of IP partners, the LEGO Group is very happy to partner with games. But then when the LEGO Group does partner with games, it's very rarely before the game is actually released, and it's normally long-standing and very well-established partners that have a huge long history of making the same kind of game in a long-running franchise. So you've got things like Mario, and you've got things like Zelda, and you've got things like Sonic, and you've got Pac-Man, for example, and even the Atari, which was something of a left-field offering, but certainly still is one that has a lot of just nostalgic fondness among LEGO fans of a particular era. What you don't see is the LEGO Group partnering with, say, Bethesda for something like Starfield, because you don't know how that's going to go, and as it turns out, Starfield ended up being something of a disappointment, and so it's really for the best that we didn't get any LEGO sets based on that, because I can't imagine they would have sold as well as the LEGO Group might have hoped. At the same time, also, Starfield is a mature game rather than something that is aimed at a younger audience. But now, even with something like Horizon Zero Dawn, the LEGO game, it's something that is a proven, very well-established brand. Sure, it's only got 2 games, much the same as Jedi Fallen Order, but they're very famous games that most people who have got a PlayStation have at least heard of. And certainly now that that exclusivity with EA has ended and Ubisoft is having a go with Star Wars as well, and we're potentially going to be getting an awful lot more Star Wars games suddenly, there's going to be more potential than ever for the LEGO Group to turn these games into sets. But at the same time, do they want to give that treatment to every single game, or do they want to hold off and see which games end up performing well before they commit to them? Because that's very much been their strategy with Disney Plus lately. It's been, well, maybe we'll do one Andor set and just see what happens. Maybe we'll do one Obi-Wan Kenobi set and just see what happens. Acolyte sets? Nah, we'll see whether or not this turns into a big thing before we actually commit. So the question of whether or not we'll get Star Wars Outlaws LEGO sets remains to be seen. We might get a little kind of thing of some kind or other, but we might not necessarily get a full set. It really does depend, and it might be that we don't necessarily get it until after the game has been proven an absolute hit. Meanwhile, we're still probably going to get that Skeleton Crew LEGO set that's been rumoured for a long time, even though the show itself seems to be endlessly delayed, which is funny because that's exactly the problem with video games. But maybe all of this is just wild speculation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Now, if you are going to be buying any LEGO Star Wars in the near future, for example, Cal Kestis and the accompanying Star Destroyer, make sure that you use the QR code that is currently on screen or the affiliate link, which is down in the description. Make sure, by the way, that you also do all of the regular YouTube things, so give this video a thumbs up and hit subscribe and the notification bell. Make sure that you go to brickfanatics.com and sign up to our newsletter so that you never miss anything LEGO related ever again, and make sure, this is very important, that you have a lovely day. Thank you very much for watching.